I'd like to welcome you today to our Bible study. We are moving on. Our primary text today is going to be Mark 11, 12 through 14, and then 20 through 25. I'm going to go down to verse 12 and then 13, 14, and then go to 20 and 21 for our session today. And then later in the week, I will finish up. Since the last time that we were together, Mark's gospel has told us several stories. You remember that last week we talked about the text where James and John had asked Jesus to do for them whatever they ask. And Jesus says, "What do you want me to ask you to do?" And their request was, when Jesus came into his glory, for them to sit on his right and left hand. And then Jesus produced a teaching about humility, and the point of Jesus' messiahship, or being the Christ, was not to lord it over other people, his authority, his power, and so forth, like the Romans did, but rather to become a servant or a doulos of all people. Now, after that particular text, we have a healing of a blind man named Bartimaeus. Some of Jesus' most important teachings happen between two healings of a blind person that are in the middle of the Gospel of Mark. And what happens after the healing of blind Bartimaeus is that the gospel begins, even though it's a rapid gospel from the very beginning, it begins a deep descent. It's like a snowball gaining momentum as it rolls down a hill or down a mountain. The gospel, as it goes into the passion story, goes faster and faster and faster and faster. And in this particular case, we have the healing of blind Bartimaeus, which sort of ends the pure teaching part of the Gospel of Mark. And then we go straight from his healing into Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem. I mentioned last week that as Roman conquering heroes come in on great white horses like the Lone Ranger's horse Silver, which is a gigantic, beautiful, pure white steed. That's the way the Romans would ride into these cities, celebrating some sort of military victory or another. Jesus comes riding in as the triumphant conqueror on a little donkey. It's a kind of a comic scene in a way. This tiny donkey struggling to hold Jesus up, Jesus' feet perhaps close to dragging on the ground. But there are all kinds of people on either side of this road into Jerusalem, and they're all throwing out cloaks and palm branches. And of course, this is our celebration of the Palm Sunday celebration that we do. Now, we come to a story about Jesus and the temple, and that is what this section is all about. So after the day of Palm Sunday, it says the next day. And so this would be for us Sunday, but for the Jews, it would have been a Sabbath day. On the next day, after leaving Bethany. Bethany is a little suburb of Jerusalem, and that is where the disciples and Jesus are all staying, kind of setting up a camp-like situation. That's where they are. It says that Jesus was hungry. There's several reasons, I suppose, that Mark would bring this up. One part is that he wanted to make sure that people understood that Jesus was a human being. Uh, human. There's a sort of heresy in the early church, and it persists even to today, that's called doceticism. And what doceticism is when people perceive that Jesus is God, but they say he only appears to be a human being. That is not true. Jesus is fully human and fully divine. That is incarnational theology. It's the theology that we believe in, that Jesus is fully human and fully divine. And the reason is because he has to actually suffer on the cross, not just appear to suffer on the cross. So when Mark says he was hungry, it is to remind us that Jesus has a human side. And it also precipitates the reason that Jesus is looking for figs on this particular fig tree was to satisfy the hunger that he had. Now, there are a lot of questions that people ask about this particular text, like why didn't Jesus eat breakfast that morning in Bethany where he was staying with the rest of the disciples and things of that nature? I don't think Mark cares about that. What Mark wants us to know is that Jesus is human and that as a human being, he's hungry. From far away, he noticed a fig tree in leaf. This would explain why, when he looked at the fig tree, he didn't instantly say, "This fig tree has no figs." But from far away, it might appear that the fig tree perhaps could have had figs on it, but probably not. So he went to see, that is, Jesus went to inspect this tree closely to see if he could find anything on it, that is, find figs on it to eat. When Jesus came to it, he found nothing except for leaves. And then we're told, since it wasn't the season for figs. And this is kind of a conundrum. Why would someone look for figs on a fig tree when it wasn't the season for figs? And the reason that Mark is telling this story in this particular way is because he is using it as a cipher to talk about something of great substance for Jewish people. First of all, we need to know that of all the kind of plants that are in Palestine at this time, the fig tree is the most important to the populace. Figs are plentiful, figs are hardy, figs are tasty, figs serve a number of uses for the population in Palestine, and so it's a very important tree. Olives too are important, but the fig tree is especially important because of its sweet fruit and desirability to eat. So it wasn't the season for figs, but Jesus was still looking for figs there. Now, what many commentators think is that Mark is using the fig tree as symbolic of the temple. For people in the first century that were Jewish, the temple was the most important place there was. It was the place of prayer. It was the place of absolute devotion. It was the center of of Palestine. And this is important to remember for one primary reason, and that is the temple is on Temple Mount. And that's why when we hear a little bit about talking about the temple, we will understand that when Jesus is talking about faith to move mountains, it's not really talking about mountains like the Rocky Mountains or the Himalayas or the Andes. He is talking about faith to move mountain, which would be the temple. And so fig tree symbolizes the temple. And so that's why this fig tree business is so important. So when Jesus So Jesus said to it, that is speaking to this fig tree, no one will ever again eat of your fruit. Um, it is an odd thing that he curses this fig tree, but if we remember that the fig tree represents the temple, in a way, Jesus is cursing the temple, which has not been kind to the people. It's taken their money and it has abused them by their powerful alliance with the Romans. His disciples heard this. The disciples heard Jesus say this, and I'm sure they were surprised. You can imagine someone cursing an innocent, solitary tree. It seems a bit bizarre unless you know the key to Mark's story here, which is that the fig tree represents the temple. Now, after the disciples heard this, things go back to normal. And then in verse 20, it says, early in the morning, that is the next day, I suppose, Jesus and his disciples were walking along, and they saw the fig tree withered from the root up. In other words, the day before Jesus had cursed this fig tree, and now this fig tree is completely dead and gone, not only at the top, but even at the root. In the book of Isaiah, there are several allusions to fig trees withering and dying. And so what Jesus may be doing is alluding to these texts from Isaiah. And then it tells us Peter remembered, and remembrance is so important to faith. As I said a few weeks ago, on communion tables all over the United States, it's inscribed, do this in remembrance. And so as we remember, it gives us strength and power for the present and impels us to go on into the future. So Peter remembered and said to Jesus, Rabbi, look how the fig tree you cursed is dried up. Peter probably didn't even need to say this because I'm sure that Jesus did notice this. But Mark tells us this to remind us that not only did Jesus know, but the disciples somehow remembered Jesus cursing this fig tree. And in remembering, they noticed. And when we come back later in the week, we'll finish this text and we'll talk about the fig tree and the temple. So I'd like to thank you very much for being here today, and we will see you next time.